In September of 2018, the Colorado Rockies were a masterpiece of raw, unforgiving beauty. The aspens had just begun to surrender to autumn, their leaves a fleeting tremor of gold against the stoic granite and deep evergreen forests. It was into this sublime wilderness that 24-year-old Clara Evans walked, carrying little more than a geologist's hammer, a specialized digital camera, and an unquenchable curiosity. She was an aspiring geologist, a doctoral candidate whose passion was not in a sterile laboratory but in the field, with her hands on the ancient stories told by rock and sediment. This solo expedition was meant to be the capstone of her research, a multi-day trek into the remote Needle's Eye quadrant of the San Juan National Forest, an area known for its unique crystalline formations and its treacherous, unpredictable terrain. Clara was not a novice. She was an experienced hiker, meticulous in her planning and respectful of the power that slept within the mountains. Before leaving the trailhead, she sent a final text to her older brother, Mark. The message was simple, almost mundane, a digital breadcrumb left for the world she was temporarily leaving behind, entering the quiet now. "We'll ping you from Eagle Point on Friday. The rocks are calling." Mark Evans, a man whose life in military logistics had taught him to measure the world in schedules and contingency plans, saved the message. Friday came and went, the silence from the mountains growing louder with each passing hour. By Saturday morning, the silence was no longer peaceful. It was a screaming void. He reported her missing, setting in motion a chain of events that would stretch over years, pulling a family into a prolonged state of suspended grief. The initial search and rescue operation was a formidable display of human will against an indifferent wilderness. Dozens of volunteers, flanked by county sheriffs and park rangers, fanned out from the trailhead, their brightly colored jackets stark against the muted tones of the landscape. Helicopters sliced through the crisp mountain air, their rotors beating a desperate rhythm against the vast quiet, their thermal cameras scanning the endless maze of canyons, ridges, and dense forest. The search area was immense, a sprawling territory where a person could vanish within 100 feet of a marked trail, swallowed by the sheer scale of the environment. The dogs tracked Clara's scent for 3 miles before it abruptly stopped at the edge of a windswept scree field, a chaotic slope of loose rock where any trail would be lost to the wind and shifting stones. For days, the team scoured the region, their hopes dwindling with each sunset that painted the peaks in hues of orange and purple. They were searching for a ghost in a cathedral of rock. Then, on the 5th day, a volunteer found her backpack. It was partially buried under a rock slide near a perilous ridge known to locals as Widow's Peak, a place notorious for sudden, violent weather shifts. The discovery was a somber milestone, a tangible piece of the woman they were looking for, yet it offered more questions than answers. The contents were mostly intact: a water filter, a first aid kit, carefully packaged food rations. Her geology hammer was missing, as was her camera, but tucked into a waterproof sleeve was her field journal. The first several pages were filled with her neat, precise handwriting, detailing rock formations, barometric pressure readings, and sketches of striated cliffs. Her observations were clinical, scientific, yet imbued with a palpable sense of wonder. The final entry, however, was starkly different. Written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl, it was dated the afternoon she disappeared. It contained only 8 words, a cryptic and unsettling fragment that defied logical explanation. "The mountain has eyes. They don't blink." These words became the epitaph of the search. The official report concluded that Clara Evans, likely disoriented by altitude or a sudden storm, had suffered a fatal fall from Widow's Peak. Her body, the report suggested, was probably lost in a deep, inaccessible crevasse or buried under a subsequent rock slide, another permanent secret kept by the mountains. The search was officially suspended, the case file stamped with the cold administrative finality of a tragedy without a resolution. For the world, the story was over. But for her brother Mark, it was an unacceptable fiction. He could not reconcile the capable, methodical sister he knew with the official narrative of a careless accident. And the words from her journal, "The mountain has eyes," had taken root in his mind, a seed of doubt that would grow into a dark and unyielding obsession over the next 5 years. The case of Clara Evans quickly faded from the news cycle, becoming just another statistic in the vast archives of missing persons in America's national parks. The file, thick with topographical maps, search grids, and transcribed interviews, was placed in a cardboard box and relegated to a dusty shelf in the county sheriff's cold case storage. For the overworked deputies, it was a closed chapter, a tragedy attributed to the inherent dangers of the wild. For Mark Evans, however, the file remained wide open, its unresolved narrative a constant, tormenting presence. He refused to let his sister's memory be archived. He spent his life savings on private search teams, hiring seasoned mountaineers to explore the areas the official search had deemed too remote or dangerous. They found nothing. He plastered missing person flyers in every small town and outpost within a 100-mile radius of the needle's eye. The image of Clara's smiling face slowly weathering under the harsh Colorado sun. He became a familiar, haunted figure in the local communities, the grieving brother who couldn't let go. His questions met with sympathetic shrugs and the patient, weary wisdom of people who understood that the mountains do not always give back what they take. His obsession strained his relationships, cost him his job, and carved deep lines into his face. He pored over Clara's journal, reading those final 8 words until they lost all meaning, and then circled back to become profoundly sinister. He researched local folklore, UFO sightings, and every outlandish theory he could find, searching for any narrative that made more sense than the one in the official police report. The sheriff's department treated him with a kind of gentle pity, listening to his calls but offering no new avenues for investigation. Without a body, without any new evidence, there was nothing they could do. The years passed. The world moved on. A new wing was added to the local library. The town's main street was repaved, and children who were in elementary school when Clara disappeared were now learning to drive. But for Mark, time had frozen in September of 2018. His life had become a vigil, a long, lonely watch at the foot of a silent mountain. He lived in a state of perpetual anticipation, waiting for a sign, for a clue, for something to break the suffocating stillness. He didn't know that the mountains were indeed keeping a secret, one that was not buried under rock, but suspended in ice, waiting for the slow, inexorable pull of time and temperature to bring it back into the light. The discovery, when it finally came, happened 5 years and 1 month after Clara Evans vanished. It was late October of 2023, a time when the high peaks of the San Juan Mountains were already encased in the first hard ice of the coming winter. 2 ice climbers, a pair of seasoned alpinists from Boulder, were attempting a new, uncharted route up the sheer northern face of the Chimera Glacier, a remote and formidable river of ice nearly 15 miles from where Clara's backpack had been found. It was an area seldom visited by humans, a vertical world of blue ice and profound silence. The glacier, like many across the globe, had been receding, and the summer's melt had been more significant than usual, peeling back layers of ice that had been in place for decades. As one of the climbers, a man named Ben Carter, drove his ice axe into a newly exposed section of the glacier, he felt it strike something that wasn't ice or rock. It had a dull, unyielding thud. Curious, he chipped away at the surrounding ice, his breath misting in the frigid air. Slowly, a dark, angular shape began to emerge. It was a camera, a digital single-lens reflex model, its body scarred and battered, but its form unmistakable. It was wedged tightly into a deep crevice, preserved in a crystalline tomb. The climbers immediately understood the potential significance of their find. In the high-altitude wilderness, lost equipment was not uncommon, but a camera, with its potential to hold images, was a time capsule. They carefully excavated it from its icy prison, wrapped it in a spare thermal layer, and upon their return to civilization, did exactly what they were supposed to do. They drove straight to the nearest sheriff's station and turned it over to the authorities. The camera was logged into evidence, another piece of lost property from the vast wilderness. But when the deputy ran the serial number through the national database, a flag appeared. The number was a perfect match for the camera registered to Clara Evans. The cold case was suddenly, shockingly, thawed. The news reached Mark Evans via a phone call from a new detective, a woman named Isabel Rossi, who had recently taken over the county's small and underfunded cold case unit. She spoke in measured, professional tones, careful not to offer false hope. but the underlying current of excitement in her voice was palpable. For Mark, the news was a seismic shock, a jolt that sent tremors through the rigid, grief-stricken world he had inhabited for 5 years. The camera was the one piece of equipment, besides his sister's geology hammer, that had been conspicuously missing. It was a voice from the void he had been screaming into for half a decade. Detective Rossi, a sharp, methodical investigator with a reputation for her relentless attention to detail, immediately understood that the camera was more than just a piece of recovered property. It was a potential witness. The SD card, miraculously, was still seated inside the camera's protected slot. The entire device was sent to the state's forensic digital imaging lab with a high-priority request. The technicians there worked for 2 days, carefully drying the camera's components and painstakingly attempting to recover the data from the fragile memory card. The world held its breath, and for the first time in 5 years, the name Clara Evans was once again in the news, her story resurrected from the archives by an improbable discovery on a frozen cliff face. Mark waited, caught in an agonizing limbo between hope and dread. He didn't know if he wanted the camera to be empty or full. An empty card would mean continued uncertainty, while a full one might hold answers he wasn't prepared to face. On the 3rd day, Detective Rossi called again. Her voice was different this time, stripped of its professional detachment, leaving only a quiet, somber gravity. "We got them," she said. "We recovered the photos." The forensic lab in Denver had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The memory card, shielded by the camera's robust casing in the deep freeze of the glacier, had preserved its data perfectly. The technicians had recovered a total of 94 photographs. Detective Rossi viewed them for the first time on a secure monitor in a small, windowless room, the clinical silence of the lab, a stark contrast to the wild, majestic landscapes that began to fill the screen. The initial images were exactly what one would expect from a geologist and aspiring photographer on a solo expedition in the Rockies. They were breathtaking wide-angle shots of sweeping valleys under a vast cerulean sky. There were detailed close-ups of quartz veins running through granite boulders, the kind of geological art that had so fascinated Clara. There were photos of her own small tent pitched against a backdrop of colossal, snow-dusted peaks, a tiny testament to human presence in an overwhelming wilderness. As Rossi clicked through the images, a portrait of Clara's final days began to emerge. She was competent, she was alone, and she was immersed in the beauty of her surroundings. The photos were serene, almost peaceful. Then came the final 12 images. The tone shifted abruptly, the camera's placid documentation turning into something else entirely. The 93rd photo was taken from the same vantage point as the 92nd, a panoramic view from a high ridge, but now a new element was present. In the far distance, standing on an opposing peak, was a figure. It was just a speck, a tiny, upright silhouette against the sky, barely distinguishable from the rocky terrain. In the next photo, the figure was closer. Clara had clearly zoomed in, her professional lens pulling the distant shape into a more defined form. It was a person, dressed in dark, weathered gear, standing perfectly still, watching. The next 5 photos were taken in rapid succession, the zoom extending further with each shot. The figure remained motionless, a silent observer across the expanse. The person's posture was not that of a fellow hiker enjoying the view. It was possessive, rooted, like the figure was a part of the mountain itself. Then the perspective changed. The following photos were no longer of the distant figure. They were taken from a lower angle, looking up the slope Clara was on. The distant observer was gone. The images were shaky, the focus slightly off, as if taken in a hurry. The second to last photo was a blurry shot of the trail ahead, but a shadow fell across the foreground, a long, distorted human shadow that wasn't her own. The final photograph was a chaotic, terrifying burst of information. It was a close-up, taken at extremely short range. The image was blurred from motion, a frantic, desperate snapshot. But a face was visible, filling the frame. It was a man's face, gaunt and weathered like old leather, with a thick, unkempt beard. His eyes, however, were shockingly clear, a pair of pale, intense irises that stared directly into the lens with an expression of cold, absolute authority. Then, nothing. The sequence ended. The camera had told its story. Detective Rossi stared at the final image, the man's chilling gaze seemingly looking right through the screen at her. The official narrative of a tragic accident had just been obliterated. Clara Evans was not alone on that mountain. She had been stalked, and in her final moments, she had turned her camera on her pursuer. The bone-chilling photos transformed the cold case into an active homicide investigation overnight. The blurry, haunting face on the camera's memory card was now the face of a killer, a ghost who had haunted the San Juan Mountains, perhaps for decades, completely unknown. The images were immediately disseminated within law enforcement circles. A silent alarm raised for a predator who had operated with impunity in one of America's most beautiful and remote wilderness areas. For Detective Rossi, the case became a singular focus. She had the victim's last moments captured in digital amber, a final, desperate act of documentation that now served as her only lead. The investigation began with the figure in the photographs. Forensic imaging specialists worked to deblur and enhance the final image, sharpening the details of the man's face, while experts on outdoor gear analyzed the blurry photos of him on the distant ridge. The clothing was functional but old, a hodgepodge of gear from different eras, some pieces appearing to be decades out of date. He wasn't a modern, well-equipped outdoorsman. He was something else, someone who lived in the mountains, not just visited them. When Mark Evans was shown the photographs, his reaction was a volatile mixture of vindication and profound horror. The years of being dismissed as an obsessive, grieving brother were instantly validated. He had been right. Something had happened to his sister. Someone had been with her. But seeing the predator's face, the cold, emotionless eyes that were the last thing his sister ever saw, filled him with a rage so profound it left him trembling. The image was seared into his memory, a target for the justice he had been denied for 5 long years. He pledged to assist Detective Rossi in any way he could, but privately, he began his own hunt, using his military background and the network of contacts he had built over the years to pursue a more direct and perhaps more dangerous path to the man in the photograph. Detective Rossi, meanwhile, pursued the official channels with methodical precision. She took the enhanced photograph to the small, isolated towns that dotted the edges of the San Juan National Forest. She showed it to retired park rangers, grizzled hunting guides, and the proprietors of old taverns where local history was preserved and stories told over cheap beer. For weeks, she was met with blank stares and shakes of the head. The man was a phantom. Then, in a dusty, forgotten corner of a library in Silverton, she found a retired Forest Service ranger, a man in his late 70s with a memory as sharp as the peaks outside his window. He looked at the photo, his eyes narrowing, and a flicker of recognition, mingled with something that looked like old fear, crossed his face. He didn't know a name, but he knew the legend. He spoke of the Sentinel, a local myth that had been circulating for over 30 years. The story was of a man, a climber, who had gone into the mountains after a tragedy and never came back out. He was said to live off-grid, a wild man who viewed the high peaks as his personal sanctuary and treated any intruders with hostility. Over the years, other hikers and climbers had disappeared in the region, their cases, like Clara's, written off as accidents. The old ranger spoke of rumors, of strange sightings of a figure watching from ridges, of supplies vanishing from backcountry cabins. The Sentinel was always dismissed as a campfire story, a bogeyman used to scare tourists. But as he stared at the face in Detective Rossi's photograph, he whispered, "I think you found him. I think you found the damn ghost of the San Juans." The legend of the Sentinel gave the investigation its first real traction, a thread of folklore to pull on. Detective Rossi began to dig into old Park Service records and county archives, searching for any reports that might corroborate the myth. She cross-referenced every missing person case within the National Forest from the last 40 years, looking for a pattern, a geographical cluster that might point to a specific territory. She discovered a disturbing trend. A disproportionate number of disappearances had occurred in the Needle's Eye Quadrant and the surrounding high-altitude areas. These were cases that had never been linked, each one treated as an isolated, unfortunate incident. Now, viewed through the lens of Clara's camera, they formed a potential constellation of serial predation. The old ranger story also provided a crucial detail. The legend began after a climbing tragedy in the 1980s. With this time frame, Rossi searched for climbing accidents in the region. She found one that stood out, a well-documented incident from 1987. Two climbers, both highly skilled and local to the area, were caught in a sudden violent storm while attempting a notoriously difficult ascent. One of the climbers, a young woman, fell to her death. Her partner survived, but he was the one who had to cut the rope. His name was Elias Thorne. The file described Thorne as being devastated by the accident, consumed by guilt and trauma. He was a known expert mountaineer, but also described in witness statements as being intensely territorial, with a quasi-mystical reverence for the mountains. After the accident, he had collected his partner's life insurance policy, liquidated his assets, and then, according to the records, he simply vanished. There was no forwarding address, no new driver's license, no credit history. He had walked away from society and, it seemed, straight into the legend of the Sentinel. Rossi's team ran the old DMV photo of Elias Thorne from 1986 through facial recognition software, comparing it to the enhanced image from Clara's camera. Even with the age progression and the beard, the software returned a high probability match. The ghost had a name. While Rossi was building a legal case, Mark Evans was on his own parallel track. Using his own funds, he acquired satellite imagery of the remote quadrant, looking for any sign of a permanent or semi-permanent shelter, a heat signature, anything that would indicate a human presence where none should be. He spent his days in the same library Rossi had visited, but he was looking at different books, old geological surveys, mining claim maps, and texts on off-grid survival. He believed Thorne would have a base, a defensible position, and he was determined to find it. The hunt for Elias Thorne was now a two-pronged assault, one official and methodical, the other personal and relentless. They were both hunting the same man, but for different reasons. For Rossi, it was about justice and the rule of law. For Mark, it was about vengeance for his sister and an answer to the question that had haunted him for 5 years. He didn't just want Thorne captured. He wanted to stand in the place where his sister took her last breath and understand what had happened. He was no longer just a grieving brother. He had become a hunter, and his prey was the man who had turned his sister's beloved mountains into a tomb. The search for Elias Thorne was unlike any standard manhunt. The suspect wasn't hiding in a city or skipping across state lines. He had dissolved into an environment that was his greatest ally. The San Juan Mountains were a fortress of his own making, a million-acre labyrinth of which he was the undisputed master. Detective Rossi's official approach involved deploying specialized teams, including seasoned trackers from the Forest Service and drone operators, to survey the vast wilderness. However, Thorne had been living off-grid for over 3 decades. He knew how to move without leaving a trace, how to use the terrain to mask his presence. The drones saw nothing but rock and trees, and the trackers found only the faintest signs of passage, old trails that could have been made by animals. The first breakthrough came from old-fashioned police work. Rossi's team located Thorne's last known property, a dilapidated cabin on the edge of the national forest that he had abandoned in the late 1980s. The property was derelict, collapsing under the weight of years of heavy snow and neglect. Inside, however, they found a time capsule of his fractured mind. Tacked to the walls were old topographical maps of the Needle's Eye Quadrant, marked with a series of strange, cryptic symbols. In a rotten footlocker, they discovered his journals from the years leading up to his disappearance. The pages were filled with a mixture of technical climbing notes and increasingly paranoid, rambling prose. He wrote about the mountains as a sentient entity, a demanding god that required purity and respect. He railed against the incursions of tourist hikers, the noise of amateur climbers, and the desecration of the wilderness. His writing revealed a man who did not just love the mountains, but worshiped them with a fanatical and dangerous devotion. After the death of his partner, his writing took an even darker turn. He began to see himself not just as a devotee, but as a guardian, a sentinel, tasked with protecting the sanctity of the high peaks. He wrote of a duty to cleanse the mountains of those he deemed unworthy, those who came with their cameras and their casual attitudes, failing to show the proper reverence. The journals were a terrifying manifesto, providing a clear motive for his decades of unseen violence. While the police were dissecting Thorne's past, Mark Evans was focused on his present. Using the old mining maps he had found, he identified a series of abandoned shafts and prospectors' shelters in the most remote parts of the quadrant, places that wouldn't appear on any modern map. He theorized that Thorne would use these forgotten relics as a network of caches and shelters. Acting on a hunch, he chartered a helicopter and, using his military experience in aerial reconnaissance, spotted what looked like a deliberately concealed structure near an old, played-out silver mine. He hiked into the area alone, against the stern warnings of Detective Rossi. What he found was a small, cleverly hidden supply cache. Inside a weatherproof container were freeze-dried food, climbing ropes, and a small collection of disturbing trophies: a single, worn hiking boot, an old-fashioned compass with a broken needle, and a silver locket containing a faded picture of an unknown family. It was chilling proof that Clara was not his only victim. The discovery of the cache provided the investigation with a crucial piece of the puzzle. The items were cross-referenced with the other missing person cases Rossi had identified, and the locket was positively identified as belonging to a woman who had vanished on a solo hike in 1999. The pattern of predation was now undeniable. Elias Thorne was a serial killer who used the vast wilderness as both his hunting ground and his graveyard. The convergence of evidence, the journals, the cache, and the geographical data from Clara's own camera allowed Rossi's team to triangulate a probable area for Thorne's main lair. The background of Clara's final horrifying photo showed a unique geological formation, a sheer wall of rock with a distinctive pattern of igneous intrusion. Geologists confirmed the location, a place called the Dragon's Tooth, an extremely remote and technically difficult to access spire in the heart of Thorne's presumed territory. Rossi now knew where the final confrontation had taken place. An operation was planned, a high-altitude tactical deployment to the Dragon's Tooth. She insisted that Mark be part of the team, not as a civilian, but as a guide. He knew the terrain, and more importantly, he knew the suspect's mindset. It was a risky decision, blending the personal with the professional, but Rossi understood that Mark's intimate knowledge of his sister's abilities and his relentless drive were assets she couldn't afford to leave behind. As the team prepared to move out, a sense of grim finality settled over the investigation. They were not just going to a location on a map, they were ascending into the heart of one man's dark kingdom, to the very place where Clara Evans had used her camera, not as an artist, but as a witness at the moment of her own death. The assault on the Dragon's Tooth began at dawn. A specialized team of tactical officers trained in high-altitude operations was airlifted to a forward base camp several miles from the target area. From there, the approach had to be made on foot. Detective Rossi and Mark Evans moved with the team, the air growing thin and cold as they ascended. The landscape was brutal and majestic, a world of sharp angles and profound drops. Mark was quiet, his focus absolute. He moved through the terrain with a grim determination, every step bringing him closer to the answers he had sought for 5 agonizing years. Using the photographs from Clara's camera as a guide, they navigated the treacherous landscape, the unique rock formations in her pictures serving as waypoints. After a grueling 6-hour climb, they reached the base of the Dragon's Tooth. It was even more imposing up close, a jagged spire of granite that clawed at the sky. A careful search of the area revealed what they were looking for, a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the rock face, cleverly concealed by a natural outcropping. It was the entrance to a cave system. The team moved in, their helmet lights cutting through the absolute darkness. The cave was not a natural wonder. It was a lair. The main chamber was filled with stolen hiking and climbing gear, a macabre collection spanning decades. Tents, backpacks, and sleeping bags were piled in a corner. On a makeshift table, more trophies were laid out in a ritualistic display. Pocket knives, sunglasses, a single earring. It was a museum of stolen lives. In the back of the cave, they found Thorne's living quarters. There was a sleeping platform, a small stove, and shelves carved into the rock. On one of these shelves sat Clara's geology hammer, its handle worn smooth from her grip. Next to it was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was her personal diary, not the field journal. Inside, tucked into the last page, was an unsent letter addressed to Mark. Reading it later, he would find her final thoughts, words of love for him and of her awe for the very mountains that would become her tomb. But Elias Thorne was not there. The lair was cold, the embers in his stove long dead. He had vanished again. Rossi, however, had anticipated this. She knew Thorne would not abandon his sanctuary forever. They didn't dismantle the site, they turned it into a trap. The team retreated, leaving behind a network of silent remote sensors and a sniper team concealed in a high-altitude hide overlooking the cave entrance. Then, they waited. For 2 days, there was nothing but the sound of the wind whistling through the rocks. On the third night, a blizzard swept in, engulfing the peaks in a blinding vortex of snow and ice. And in the heart of the storm, a sensor tripped. He was back. Thorne moved through the blizzard like a phantom, his knowledge of the terrain making him almost invisible even to the thermoscopes. He was heading for the cave. The standoff was brief and violent. As he approached the entrance, the team announced their presence. He didn't surrender. Instead, he lunged for a concealed ice axe and tried to flee, scrambling up a sheer rock face with inhuman speed. But he was cornered. A single, well-aimed shot from the sniper disabled him, a bullet to the leg that sent him tumbling back into the snow. The sentinel of the San Juans, the ghost who had haunted the mountains for 30 years, was finally captured. He lay in the snow, wounded and defeated, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, not at being caught, but at the violation of his sacred, silent kingdom. The interrogation of Elias Thorne was not a confession in the typical sense, it was a lecture. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit room at the county jail, stripped of his mountain kingdom, he was diminished but unrepentant. He spoke of his actions not with guilt, but with a chilling, self-righteous clarity. He was, in his own mind, a righteous instrument of the mountains themselves. He recounted the day he encountered Clara Evans. He had been watching her for 2 days, observing her movements, judging her. He said she was skilled, respectful, but that she had ventured too deep into a part of the mountains he considered sacred, a place of profound silence that he had sworn to protect. He saw her camera not as a tool for appreciating beauty, but as an instrument of desecration, an attempt to capture and diminish the mountain's soul. He confronted her, intending only to scare her away, to make her turn back. But she hadn't been afraid. Instead, she had raised her camera and taken his picture. To Thorne, this was the ultimate act of defiance, a violation of his solitude and his authority. He admitted to killing her in a fit of rage and then, in an act he described as a final offering, he had carried her body to a deep, permanent crevasse in the Chimera Glacier, returning her to the ice he believed was the heart of the mountain. He spoke of the others as well, the trespassers, whose trinkets Mark had found in his caches. Each one had committed a similar sin in his eyes, and each one had been claimed by the mountain, with him as its agent. Guided by Thorne's dispassionate directions, a specialized glacial recovery team was dispatched to the crevasse on the Chimera Glacier. There, preserved in the ancient blue ice, they found Clara. She was finally brought home. The funeral was a quiet affair, attended by family and a few of her colleagues from the university. Mark Evans stood before the simple gravestone, his sister's recovered geology hammer in his hand. He had the answers he had fought for, the truth that had cost him 5 years of his life. But the knowledge brought no peace, only a profound, aching emptiness. The conviction of Elias Thorne was a formality. His journals, the evidence from his lair, and his own chilling testimony sealed his fate. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, a cage of concrete and steel, a world away from the granite spires and silent valleys he had both worshipped and terrorized. The legend of the Sentinel was over, replaced by the grim reality of a lonely, delusional killer. For the communities around the San Juan Mountains, the resolution of the case left a permanent scar, a reminder that the most monstrous secrets can hide in the most beautiful of places. Mark eventually moved away from Colorado, unable to look at the majestic peaks without seeing his sister's final, desperate moments. The mountains remained silent and indifferent, their beauty undiminished, but forever colored by the story of the woman who had loved them, the killer who had worshipped them, and the camera that had held the terrible truth, frozen in time, its lens like a single, unblinking eye that had finally shared what it saw.